And good evening, everybody. My name is Evan Weiner. I have been around the NFL since 1978. That's the cover of my ebook, America Passion. How a coal miner's game became the NFL in the 20th century. And the NFL became the NFL with a lot of dumb luck and meeting a couple of the right people at the right time, even though they were not exactly there in the NFL's best interest in terms of Lamar Hunt and Bud Adams in the American Football League. As I said, the National Football League never had a business plan. They had guys like Art Rooney, who had a hotel suite in a hotel in Pittsburgh. You went, you played cards with him, he gave you free tickets. George Halas was actually broke at one time during the Depression, and the Green Bay Packers, Curly Lambeau, gave him money. Halas gave him an IOU, and he was able to meet the Chicago Bears payroll. Think of that. Green Bay Packers helping the Chicago Bears stay alive. And the New York Giants, the only way they stayed alive was Red Grange came through town playing with the Chicago Bears. They had 75,000 people at the Polo Grounds, and that stuffed enough money in Tim Mara's pocket to keep the Giants going. Early days in the NFL, bootleggers and gamblers were the owners. Football was first played in America back in 1869. It was a college game between Rutgers and Princeton. The coal miners game, from the mom and pop store to a multi-billion-dollar business. The roots of this game, a lot of them in the coal mines in western Pennsylvania. But as I said, the first game that was played that was called football was Princeton against Rutgers in New Jersey. It didn't resemble the game that you see today. It might resemble the game that you might see with the Jets tonight, because the Jets are so awful, as is the Broncos. Rutgers won that game by a score of 6-4. Let's see, that would be 2 safeties and 2 field goals tonight. They played the first game November 6th, 1869, and it was played with 2 teams, 25 men, and it was rugby-like rules, nothing like you see today in the NFL or in college. The teams lined up with 2 members of each team, remaining more or less stationary near the opponent's goal line, in hopes of being able to slip over and score from an unguarded position. The remaining 23 players were divided into groups of 11 and 12. 11 fielders lined up in their own territory as defenders, and the 12 Bulldogs carried the battle. Football hasn't changed very much since then. As Jeff Buren, who was Al Davis's attorney with the Oakland Raiders, my best friend in the NFL, as he once said, the object of football is 11 guys beating up the other 11 guys, with the most guys standing generally winning. Sounds like a Kansas City Chiefs Oakland Raiders game from the 1969, 1970. The first rules for American football were written in 1876. Walter Camp, and up in New Haven, there's an annual Walter Camp dinner for college football players, the best college football players. He was the coach at Yale University eventually, and he would become the father of American football. And he figured out how to put together rules to make this game interesting for people. Pudge Heffenfinger, he was with the Allegheny Athletic Association and the Pittsburgh Athletic Club. He was the first player ever to get money to play a game. He was a guard. He was paid $500 by the FFA, or rather the AAA, to play in a game against the Pittsburgh Athletic Club. So he was the first player ever to get paid playing pro football. John Braylord, he was a young guy. He was a teenager. He was 16 years old. He became the first player to openly accept money to play football, and he played it for Latrobe, Arnold Palmer's hometown, and he got expenses to play for the Latrobe YMCA against the Jeannette Athletic Club. The AAA team fielded a completely professional team for a 2-game season in 1896. So it's all coal miners playing at this point. That is the Latrobe football team, and I like the guy there in the middle of the picture there. He's got a derby. I could just imagine somebody running on the football field with a derby. Who knows? He might have played with it. No leather helmets at that point. The Latrobe Athletic Association was the first professional football team in the United States. Now, the NFL's oldest team is still playing. They're playing in Glendale, Arizona now. They're known as the Arizona Cardinals, but they started out in life in Chicago as the Morgan Athletic Club. It was a neighborhood team, 1899. They played Morgan Athletic Club, formed on the south side of Chicago. The team would later become known as the Normals, then Racine for a street in Chicago, the Racine Cardinals, because they had reddish uniforms, then the Chicago Cardinals. The team would relocate to St. Louis in 1960. And when I talk about the NFL didn't have a business plan, in the 1950s, the NFL discovered TV. There was a problem in Chicago because in 1950-51, home teams decided not to put their games on TV. Two teams in Chicago, Chicago Bears, Chicago Cardinals, which meant WBBM in Chicago, which had the rights to both the Bears and Cardinals games, could never show any games. To alleviate some of the problems, St. Louis in, say, 1957, 58, 59 would play games in Minneapolis or play games in Buffalo, so Chicago would get two games in. In 1960, CBS kind of gave Bill Bidwell and the Bidwell family $500,000. Go to St. Louis, open the market up for us. Now that $500,000, $500,000, officially went to the Bidwell family to move the grandstands from Chicago's Comiskey Park to Sportsman's Park in St. Louis. Where'd the money come from? It came from CBS. Bill Paley. Paley wanted the Chicago market and gave the Bidwells $500,000. Goodbye, see you later. Oh, and by the way, thanks. We can now show 6 Bears games or 7 Bears games, 1960 on TV in Chicago. In 1988, Bidwell moved his team to Tempe, Arizona, called it the Phoenix Cardinals, renamed the team the Arizona Cardinals. They moved from Tempe to Glendale, and the team is the oldest continuing football operation in football, pro football, now in the NFL. There was another Chicago team, 1902, the Chicago Football League, and they have the championship. Philadelphia A's baseball team and the Philadelphia Phillies baseball team merged together for a football team, joining the Pittsburgh Stars in the first attempt at the National Football League. That was it. Those were really the only teams in 1902. The baseball players were looking for extra money, and Connie Mack was involved in that, and he got the Phillies involved as well. And that was going to be the first NFL. The Chicago Football League, well, that was several clubs: Chicago Tigers, Hammond, Indiana, Rockford, Illinois, Decatur, Racine, Illinois, Milwaukee. There was another team in Ohio. There was the New York State League. By 1904, Ohio had at least 7 pro teams. And when you talk about pro teams, these guys might have gotten $5 each to play. I knew a guy, when I gave talks 25 years ago, the guy was in his 80s at the time, who played with the Staten Island Stapletons in the National Football League back in the 1920s. And he said he got $10 a game back in the 1920s. So Ohio had at least 7 pro teams. Massillon, not the high school. Massillon High School seems to always win championships. But Massillon, the pro football team, won the title of the Ohio Independent Championship. That's what it was called. College football and pro football. Could have been saved by this guy. Maybe not saved by this guy. But Theodore Roosevelt has a place in football history, particularly on the college level. By 1904 and 1905, there was a lot of death around football. 22 players were killed on the football field in 1904 and 18 in 1905. So there was at least 40 that we know of. We don't even know what happened in the so-called pro leagues in the coal mines. And Roosevelt is getting hammered from Charles Eliot at Harvard University that it's time to get rid of football. And Roosevelt is looking at what's going on, and he is reading the tea leaves, so to speak, and he decides to get involved in the bully pulpit and the Oval Office. Theodore Roosevelt threatens to ban football in America unless rules were implemented to make the game safer. Reported 40 players died of injuries. suffered on the field in 1904 and 1905. Except no one could actually figure out what Roosevelt could actually do. What can the president do? This is a football game. When are you going to go to Latrobe and just tell the guys on the field, oh, the president said you can't play football today? They just laugh at whoever was telling them they couldn't play football. So how do you ban the game? But he's in the Oval Office and he can make a lot of noise. Well, hey, speak softly, carry a big stick was Roosevelt. And he decides, you know what, we are going to get these guys in a room, Charles Eliot from Harvard, the president of Yale, and Walter Camp, and also the people from Princeton, and we're going to bang their heads together and we're going to make the game safer. So Roosevelt also hated the president of Harvard, Charles Eliot. And the Harvard contingent wanted to change football or just get rid of it. Now, Walter Camp wrote the rules. So Yale's not going to want to get rid of it. And Princeton was kind of on the fence. But if you had papers back in those days, newspapers back in those days, chances are you would see a cartoon similar to that. And here's a guy, obviously it's a skeleton. He's dead. And he's got wrapped around him death and wrapped around something around his head on the football field, the 12th player in every football game, death. And take a look at the size of that football because it pretty much approximated what footballs looked like back in those days. They were watermelon shaped, and you cannot necessarily throw a watermelon forward. That's what they were, watermelon shaped. Roosevelt, I demand that football change its rules or be abolished. Change the game or forsake it. But Teddy Roosevelt really did not want to get rid of football. Didn't want to get rid of football because his son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., played the game, suffered major injuries in high school and in Harvard, but he played the game. And Roosevelt was an outdoorsman. He wanted somebody with vim and vigor because he thought outdoorsmen were healthier because he was a sickly kid and became an outdoorsman. Roosevelt also had a soft spot for the game for one other reason. As the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he decided to lead the troops during the war, the Spanish-American War that Randolph Hearst really wanted because, as he said, you supply the war, we'll supply the pictures in his Hearst newspapers. So Roosevelt actually, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, goes down to Cuba, goes up San Juan Hill, and he's got his Rough Riders. And when they write their occupations, they give their occupations to Roosevelt, 10 of the Rough Riders, the soldiers who fought with him in Cuba, San Juan Hill, listed their occupations as football players. So he's got all this, his son, the Rough Riders, his hatred of Charles Eliot. So he's not really getting rid of the game. He gets them in the Oval Office. He bangs their heads together. Finally, they come up with something. It's called the American Football Rules Committee. It's formed right after the Oval Office meeting in 1905, 1906, and they decide to open up the game. And how are they going to open up the game, make it less dangerous to play? Well, they come up with some ideas. Used to be, in the old days, first down, 5 yards to go for a first down. Okay, we'll double that, first down, 10 yards to go, because it's harder to pick up a player and just throw them, which is what they were doing. They were literally picking up players and throwing them forward. So it's harder to get that kind of yardage when it's 1st and 10 instead of 1st and 5. The committee also passed legislation that led to the introduction of the forward pass, which meant they had to change the football a little bit. Before, you could throw the ball behind you and run ahead. They also changed mass formations. You couldn't throw players anymore. Gang tackling was banned. And they thought, hey, that's going to change the game. It's going to make it safer for everybody. That was in 1906. And 114 years later, there is a question about whether they ever did make the game safer with the concussion issue, although that issue has been swept under the rug by the NFL, by college football. The guy who discovered CTE, Dr. Bennett Amalu, who I saw about 3-4 years ago, talked to him. He's kind of been discredited by the football people who continue to say they're not sure that playing football causes brain injuries. Nobody talks about it anymore. They don't bring it up. Jim Thorpe, greatest athlete in the first half of the 20th century, as voted upon by the Associated Press. Jim Thorpe could play football and he could play baseball, and he played football rather well. In 1915, Jack Cusick signs Jim Thorpe and names him the coach, and also names his team, the Canton Bulldogs, but he names Thorpe the coach. With Thorpe and his former Carlisle Indian teammate Pete Calick starring, Canton goes 9-0-1. They win the Ohio League Championship and claim the Pro Football Championship in 1906. Meanwhile, up in Green Bay, there's this guy, Curly Lambeau. Looks like he's been named after his hair, Curly Lambeau. And he's trying to put together a football team in Green Bay. And he goes to the Indian Packing Company, meat company, and looks for help. In 1919, Earl Curly Lambeau and George Calhoun organized the Green Bay Packers. The namesake was Lambeau's employee, the Indian Packing Company, and they gave Lambeau $500 to buy equipment and allowed the team to use the company's field for practice. Curly Lambeau didn't own the team, but kind of owned the team. Green Bay would soon become a community-owned team, but that's Curly Lambeau in 1919. The NFL is coming, but not quite yet. 1920, Akron Pros, they're the champions of pro football. And it would be in Canton, Ohio, that people decided, you know, there are too many leagues. There's this New York League, there's Ohio League, Illinois League, and you got the coal miners in Western Pennsylvania. We got to figure out something because we have to stop the dramatic rising salaries. Somebody might get paid $25 for a game. We can't afford that when franchises are going for $100. So far too many leagues. So these guys meet in Canton, Ohio. George Hallis is there. They meet in an automobile dealership. And they decide, you know what, let us form this league. And this is what we need to do. We got to stop these salaries that are rising, which is always something you hear in sports. These players are going from one team to another team. They're just getting the highest offer and they're taking it. They'll leave our team for somebody else. And you know what? Let's stop using players that are enrolled in school. John Bankert, who was the late John Bankert, who was the head of the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio. He and I, about 20 years ago, were talking about this going on in the 1920s. And he said there's a picture, or was a picture back then, of a guy by the name of George Tafton, who played at Notre Dame University. And he was a center, snapped the ball, and he was missing his index finger. And he tells the story that there's these two guys playing pro football one day, and one guy says to the other guy, to George, "Hey, didn't I see you play for Notre Dame yesterday?" He said, "Not me, not me, not me." He said, "It's funny because the guy I played, he was also missing a finger." They used to hide behind these masks that they would only have their eyes cut out, covering their nose and all, so people wouldn't see that they were college players, except for George, because he was missing a finger. The Akron Pros, Canton Bulldogs, Cleveland Indians, and Dayton Triangles were at the meeting in Canton, and they formed the American Professional Football Conference. A second meeting followed, and there were teams from Ohio, Indiana, New York, and Illinois in attendance. And the league, the name became the American Professional Football Association. The NFL, the Staley team in Decatur, Illinois, who had a former New York Yankees right fielder. I think he lost his job with the New York Yankees to a guy named George Herman Ruth. Babe Ruth, George Hallis lost his job to Babe Ruth. Imagine that. The Chicago Bears start in 1921. A.E. Staley turns the Decatur Staleys over to George Hallis. George moves the team to what was then called Cubs Park in Chicago. Staley paid Hallis $5,000 to keep the name Staley's for one more year, Carr. And Hallis made a halfback by the name of Ed Dutch Sternman, his partner. And that's Fritz Pollard. And Fritz is still honored to this day with the Fritz Pollard Society, an organization dedicated to finding qualified African Americans to coach in the NFL, whether as a head coach or an assistant coach, or be a general manager, assistant general manager. He was in the league very, very early. He was the player coach of the Akron team. And he was one of two African Americans in the league. He earned another distinction. He was the first African American head coach in NFL history when the pros named him co-coach of that team. And then suddenly he was on the outside looking in. Pollard Brown University to Akron. It was evident in my first year at Akron before the NFL that they didn't want blacks there getting that money. And here I was playing and coaching and pulling down the highest salary in pro football. Eventually, the National Football League would ban African-American players after 1932, and they would not return to the NFL until 1946. That is the Packers, the Green Bay Packers, and that was Curly Lambeau's team. See, there was a problem with Green Bay. They had to leave the APFA because they were caught playing players who had college eligibility in 1921. They were caught. They were the only team caught. Promising to obey league rules, Curly Lambeau used $50 of his own money, $50 to buy the franchise back. And then he went broke. Local merchants arranged a $2,500 loan for the team, and a non-public, non-profit corporation was set up to operate the team. Nearly 100 years later, 98 years later, it is still a public nonprofit corporation that sells stocks that is basically worthless. I mean, you buy it, but it's worthless. It just goes to the team. You're not the owner. There is a board of directors that run the Green Bay Packers, and you have one guy who is actually the head and represents the league. But that happened back then because Green Bay had no money. Green Bay is the smallest market with a major league team in North America. Red Grange, the galloping ghost, University of Illinois running back. Red Grange probably saved the National Football League by leaving college early and signing with the Chicago Bears illegally. George Halas next year decided you can't use college players during the regular season. But Red Grange saved the New York Giants, even though he never played a game with the New York Giants. Late in the 1925 season, the Galloping Ghost, Red Grange, who was one of those 1920s big sports heroes like Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey, and he was up there with Lucky Lindy, Charles Lindbergh, and Al Jolson, and those type of people, Rudolph Valentino. He was nationally known, and I'm not sure if he was internationally known. The other guys, some of them were internationally known. But the NFL added Red Grange, who was the best player in college football in 1925 before his college eligibility was up at the University of Illinois, and he played with the Chicago Bears. Now, the Grange signing clearly violated NFL rules, but George Halas was running the league by this point, against signing players before they completed their college eligibility. But Red Grange goes barnstorming, and subsequently the national barnstorming tour of the Chicago Bears got publicity, got people in the stands, and more than likely saved the NFL from absolute ruin. When you talk about players and you talk about the most important people in the NFL, and Art Modell, I hate to name drop, but Art Modell and I, the one-time Cleveland Browns owner, the late Art Modell, and the Baltimore Ravens, I said to Art one day, I said, "This is the most important person in the history of football in this country." He says, "George Halas." I said, "No, it's not." He said, "Well, who then?" I said, "Well, for you, it's Theodore Roosevelt, as I explained, Emanuel Seller, who actually came up with the TV plan, Brooklyn congressman in 1961, and Ronald Reagan by rewriting the tax code laws in 1986. And Art just looked at me and he said, "What about George Halas?" I said, "Red Grange was more important than George Halas." And Modell thought about it for a minute and he says, "You know what, USOB? You're probably right." High compliment from Art Modell. The Grange signing did violate the rules, but it helped. On Thanksgiving Day in 1925, the largest crowd in pro football history watched Red Grange as the Bears played the Chicago Cardinals at Wrigley Field. 36,000, which meant the stadium was stuffed. At the beginning of December, the Bears won on an 8-game, 12-day barnstorming tour. It was in St. Louis. It was in Philadelphia. It was in New York at the Polo Grounds. It was down in Washington. It was up in Boston. It was in Pittsburgh. It was in Detroit, and then back to Chicago. There he is, the Galloping Ghost. Now, the Giants have never retired Red Grange's number, but they sure should have. There was a crowd of 73,000 people that came to the Polo Grounds in Manhattan, and they watched the Chicago Bears play the New York Giants. The New York Giants were owned by a guy by the name of Tim Mara. Tim Mara was a bookie. He wasn't even a big-time bookie. He was a small-town bookie. He was also a bootlegger. Eventually in New York, the guy who owned the Brooklyn Dodgers NFL team, Big Bill Dwyer, he was also a bookie, and he was also a bootlegger. In fact, you go through the early days in the NFL, and you find that this league was filled with bootleggers and gamblers, and they had no plan. They didn't know what was going on. They just threw out guys to play football. Anyway, 73,000 people come, and then all the money goes into Tim Mara's pocket, and voila, he can come back in 1926, and they establish themselves, and they become the New York Giants. They don't want to tell you that part of the history. The record attendance was beaten when the Bears go out to defeat the Los Angeles Tigers, an NFL team that never played an official game in the NFL, as in Los Angeles. They were a road team for a little while. And that was in front of 75,000 fans. And Grange was so good and drew so many people, and he had an agent. Players didn't have agents in those days, but he had an agent, cash and carry Pyle, C.C. Pyle, and he represented Red Grange. And the contract was only for 1925. And Pyle goes to the NFL, says, we want a franchise. But the NFL says, no, you're not going to have one, because they're protecting Tim Mara, the first in a series of maneuvers that protected the Mara family, which continued into 1966. So there's the American Football League One. The Los Angeles Wildcats are there. Pyle gets a 5-year lease at Yankee Stadium. The NFL doesn't want him, so I got LA, which was a small town in those days. I got New York. We're going to form a league. We're going to form a league, and we're going to be called the New York Yankees, and the LA team would become a road team. The first NFL team was in LA in 1926, the LA Buccaneers. That was a road team based in Chicago. It was made up of Californians, primarily people from the University of California and University of Southern California alumni. You know who should have been on that team but never was kicked off that team? A guy by the name of Marion Morrison, who was at the University of Southern California. He went to work as an extra on the Fox lot and changed his name, and you probably know him as John Wayne today. He never played in the NFL. The Buccaneers did play two true home games, both of them exhibition games, against the AFL's New York Yankees in January 1927. They also played 2 games in San Francisco, including the last game of the Buccaneers' existence, an exhibition game against the AFL's Wildcats. What were the football salaries? Well, the guy I knew in Riverdale in the Bronx said he got paid $10 a game. Some historians claim it was $75 to $100 a game. Average ticket price $1, 15 players per game. Revenues initially generated through paid attendance and some concessions. No TV. There was radio in these days, but their games weren't on radio. Standard game contract provided for guaranteed payment to the visiting team of about $1,000, or 40% of the gate receipts after deducting 15% for rental and maintenance of the field. Now there is George Hallis and there is Curly Lambeau, and we hear all the time about this savage rivalry between the Bears and the Packers, how the Bears and Packers hated one another, and that it was just people hated each other with the rivalry. Not quite the case. By 1931, the NFL is down to 10 teams, and then down to 8 teams in 1932. Green Bay, of all places, Curly Lambeau, who was broke and had to get a bailout from local citizens and made his team a public team, saves the Chicago Bears. $1,500 loan so George Halas could meet the payroll. 1994, I was up in Green Bay, and Lee Remmel was the Green Bay Packers PR guy, eventually became the head of the Green Bay Packers Museum. And we're walking around one day before a game, and he takes me down to a room, and I see this IOU, the IOU from Curly Lambeau to George Halas. Here's the $1,500. The IOU back is George Halas writing IOU $1,500. It's in the museum up there. You got to be a football hero. Now, baseball had the Thayer poem, Casey at the Bat. They had the song, Take Me Out to the Ball Game. They were featured in movies, and eventually there would be the Abbott and Costello, Who's on First. And that garnered baseball an awful lot of attention. Early Hollywood movies in the early 1930s based on the college game. Now, when I do this particular talk with colleges, or a variation of this talk, I always tell the college students, get a copy of Horse Feathers. It was written in 1932, and it lampooned college sports. How college sports coaches were looking for, they didn't care if they were students or not, they were just looking for guys who could play football. Quincy Adams Wagstaff is the new president of Huxley University, Groucho Marx. And he's looking for the best players. So he goes into the speakeasy, and he's looking for the 2 best players around, the big thuggy guys. And he decides he's going to hire 2 speakeasy characters, Baravelli, Chico Marx, and Pinky, Harpo Marx, to help his school win the big football game against the rival Darwin University. Go watch the movie. The end is great. Mickey Mouse and Popeye were subjects in the first 2 cartoons about football. You gotta be a football hero to get along with the beautiful girls. Sheet music, sheet music. Al Sherman, not Allie Sherman, who coached the Giants. Al Sherman, Buddy Fields, and Al Lewis, not Grandpa Munster. They were the ones who wrote, You Gotta Be a Football Hero. And you gotta be a football hero, like Zeppo, Groucho, Harpo, and Chico, or Mickey Mouse. Or if you're trying to court Olive Oyl, hey, you gotta show who's the better person there, Brutus, or Bluto, or Popeye. J.A. Richards changes the economics of football in 1934. He owns a radio station in Detroit, WJR, and he buys a football team, and he moves them to Detroit. In 1934, G.A. Richards, who's got an NBC affiliation with Sarnoff, decides that he's going to play a Thanksgiving game, and he's going to put that game on national radio. It becomes a revenue generator, thanks to G.A. Richards. Within a few years, the NFL in 1939 is on the early versions of television in the New York City area before 1,000 sets of people watching those sets. There is a second incarnation in the American Football League, and that becomes a rival to the NFL in 1936. They don't have a business plan either. The NFL had 9 teams, and many of the teams played in large population centers. The AFL competed directly with the NFL in many of those cities. The AFL would fold, but the NFL would take its first team from another league, the Cleveland Rams, in 1937. That team lasted till 1946, moved out to LA, Anaheim in 1980. In 1995, St. Louis, and a couple of years ago, back to LA. World War II and the NFL. World War II took its toll on the NFL. Teams survive by recruiting retired players or using college players. I talked to Dan Rooney one day, the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and Pittsburgh was a problem during the war. Teams located near Army and Navy bases could use players stationed near their cities. Chicago had no problems with the Bears or the Cardinals. Philadelphia had no problem with the Navy Yard. Camp Shanks was up in New York, so was West Point. So there was no problem. There was a Navy port on the Hudson River right across the way from Lower Manhattan. So it's not a problem at all. So a lot of these cities didn't have a problem. But Pittsburgh was a problem because there were no nearby military bases. In 1943, Art Rooney merged his team with Philadelphia to get extra players who were stationed at a nearby military base in Philadelphia. They were called the Steagles. In 1944, after the Eagles decided they didn't like the arrangement, Rooney was able to merge his team with the Chicago Cardinals. They became known as Carpet for the same reason. Dan Rooney also told me one other thing. The NFL did not know if it could play in 1942 because of World War II. And Franklin Roosevelt sends a letter to Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the Major League Baseball commissioner. And it's called the Green Light Letter after Landis asked if Major League Baseball could play in 1942. And Roosevelt said, yeah, go ahead and play. The other leagues that were around at that time, the NFL, the National Hockey League, and whatever form of basketball, the National Basketball League in the Midwest, which were company teams, took that letter to say we could play as well. The AAFC and the color barrier, as you see Marion Motley over there with the Cleveland Browns. The NFL is still a mom and pop operation when it gets competition after World War II. A guy by the name of Arch Ward in Chicago, who came up with the concept of the Major League Baseball All-Star Game, who was a sports writer for a Chicago paper, convinced a bunch of people that there was room for another football league. Black or Negro players would return to NFL rosters in 1946, not 45, 46, it's a typo, for the first time. That ended in 1945, and it ended not because the owners wanted. Now, supposedly George Preston Marshall bought the Boston team in 1932 and was a racist. There was no ifs, ands, and buts. He was a racist. Convinced the other owners to get every Negro player out of the league after the 1932 season. And that continued. Paul Brown was the head of the Cleveland Browns of the All-American Football Conference. And Paul once told me many years ago, I didn't care if a player was green, yellow, black, white, chartreuse. If he could play, he was on my football team. Didn't matter to Paul. It was no big deal to Paul. The NFL does come to Los Angeles in 1946. Kirk Douglas wasn't part of the Los Angeles Rams, but the guy in front of him, Woody Strode, was part of the Los Angeles Rams, and that's the movie Spartacus, which starred Bernie Schwartz and Tony Curtis. Daniel Reeves, he owns the Cleveland Rams in the National Football League, and he decides to move to Los Angeles, and he's going to play in the Los Angeles Coliseum. Except Los Angeles Coliseum is built with federal money, or some federal money. And it was built with getting an Olympics eventually, and that's where they got the federal money. And so he goes to the Coliseum Commission, and he says, I want to play here. And the Coliseum Commission says, okay, we'll give you a lease. But there's a problem with the lease. You have to hire Negro players. Reeves goes back to the National Football League owners and says, I got a lease here. I want to go there. And he needs everybody to say, you could go there. He's got one holdout, George Preston Marshall. He goes back to the Coliseum Commission and he says, I can't do it. And they said, well, we can't do it. Eventually, the Coliseum Commission puts the boot to the NFL's neck, and they come up with an agreement. And also the other thing was that there was a team in the All-American Football Conference that was going to be playing there as well, and the NFL wanted the LA market. San Francisco 49ers started playing also in the All-American Football Conference, along with Cleveland and the Baltimore Colts. They would join the NFL in 1950. So breaking the color barrier, that was a big thing in 1946. So the Cleveland Rams hire Kenny Washington and Woody Strode. The NFL has this color barrier through 1945, there's Marion Motley with Paul Brown. Bill Willis and Marion Motley were hired by Paul Brown, and they became teammates, lifelong friends. They endured taunts, racial slurs, dirty play from opponents on the field. There was a game between the Miami Seahawks and the Cleveland Browns, and Paul Brown didn't bring him down to Miami because there were death threats against them. Their teammates welcomed them. Speaking of Miami, the late Wally Triplett, who passed away a couple of years ago, maybe last year, he was in Philadelphia. He played with the Detroit Lions eventually. And we were talking one day, and he said that the University of Miami recruited him. They did not know he was Negro. And he sent them back a letter saying, I don't know why you want me. I am a Negro. Are you sure you want me to play in Miami? He got a letter back very quickly. We didn't know you were a Negro. Thanks anyway. Good luck somewhere else. The Los Angeles Rams, the other thing about the Rams that was interesting is that Admiral TV, remember the Admiral TVs? The old Admirals, and they were pretty good TV. They decided to go into a partnership to sell TVs. After all, this is 1948, 1949. And they decide, okay, we are going to buy all of the Los Angeles Rams games, and we are going to put it on TV. And the Los Angeles Rams home games are included in this whole thing. In 1949, the Rams franchise for the 6 games drew 300,000 fans. In 1950, the home games were televised. It was down to 150,000. People decided, why go out to the Coliseum when we could watch the game? Again, no planning here. No planning at all. Burt Bell, the NFL commissioner, is watching this, and he says, you know, with this new TV thing, and we're not sure about this TV thing. It may work for us. It may not work for us. Same thing with Major League Baseball. They were thoroughly unsure baseball could actually work for them, because if you got the games on TV, why would anybody come to see the games? That's what the thinking was back in those days. And there weren't that many TV stations across the country at that point. So Burt Bell tells his owners, he's the NFL commissioner, owned Philadelphia at one time, you know, don't televise the home games. And they have the blackout rule. And the blackout rule may have skirted antitrust laws, may not have skirted antitrust laws. It's still being debated 70 years later, with the FCC suggesting many times to end the rule. But they didn't. People came back to Rams games in 1951. Told you there's no plan. There's no business plan. That's Stan Jones. Stan Jones and I spent some time together talking about the George Halas days in Chicago in the mid-1950s and Green Bay and other things. The NFL has 13 teams in 1950. They take 3 teams from the All-American Football Conference. Baltimore would move to New York in 1951, second incarnation of the New York Yankees football team, and have to pay the Mariners because they're invading the territory. They would leave after 1951. They would go down to Dallas and become the Texans. They folded after 4 games. The team would relocate to practice 4 home games in Dallas, I should say. It was around Thanksgiving. They fold. Owners give the team back. And they end up in Hershey, Pennsylvania practicing. And they end up playing the Thanksgiving game. They were supposed to play the Thanksgiving game, Dallas in 1952. They're still the home team. They end up playing it in Akron. And they end up beating the Chicago Bears. The only game that Dallas won that year. Dallas would fold, and then Carol Rosenblum would pick them up in Baltimore. The NFL was just a semi-pro league. That's all they were. They were open between June and the end of the season. 6 weeks training camp, 12 weeks, 8 weeks training camp, 12 weeks worth of games. Stan Jones was an offensive lineman, and the season would finish in December, and he had to get another job. We weren't a full-time operation. A lot of people don't realize that. The football teams closed up after the last game of the year, packed everything away. George Halas wasn't a full-time football man himself. Most players were not even paid during the 8 weeks of training camp in the 1950s. In fact, the players didn't have their own equipment except for shoes, and the team shared all the other equipment. And Jones was telling me that when a guy was cut, Somebody would pay him $1 for the shoes, and the new guy would come in and they'd sell the shoes to somebody else for $2, so they'd make $1 so they could drink some beer. In 1956, the NFL is beginning to get jolted. The Art Rooneys of the world, and the Tim Maras of the world, and George Halas and George Preston Marshalls of the world, all those guys who just saw football for what it was, a semi-pro operation, they're beginning to look, hey, maybe we should start getting extra teams. Let's go back to Dallas. Let's go to Houston. There were some problems both in Dallas and Houston. One problem was that the NFL was afraid for black players in Dallas. In fact, when the Dallas Texans got there, Art Rooney voted against it because he wasn't sure that if the Texans had black players, and there were a quota of 4 black players per team through the 1960s in the NFL, as Wally Triplett told me once, he wasn't sure that one of the players wasn't going to be shot, so he voted against putting the Dallas Texans or the New York Yankees in Dallas. The Chicago Cardinals would become the team targeted because of TV, because CBS could not show Chicago Bear games, and the Bears were the Bears. Also at this time, George Halas was going up to Green Bay, and he was going to dances and all this other stuff as the Green Bay Packers board of directors and shareholders decided they needed a new stadium, and Halas, returning Curly Lambeau's favor, went up there, even though he was allegedly hated up there, to help raise money to build what is now known as Lambeau Field. So the Cardinals become a target. They play some games in Minneapolis, in the new stadium in Minneapolis. They play some games in the rock pile up in Buffalo. Buffalo was not included in the NFL AAFC consolidation. Their owners went to Cleveland to be part owners of the Cleveland Browns. So they're kicking the tires elsewhere. The 1958 NFL championship game changes pro football. Why? Greatest game ever played, although Artie Donovan said it was a lousy game. But Johnny Unitas brings the Baltimore Colts downfield and wins the game over the New York Giants in overtime. There was added drama in the game because NBC lost the video because some players stepped on the wire and the wire came loose and took a while to put the wire back together. NBC had that game. Changes pro football. Meanwhile, Lamar Hunt is in Dallas and Bud Adams is in Houston, and they're getting nowhere with the NFL, with Halas, with Art Rooney and the other owners. And after a while, they give up their dreams to get teams in the NFL, and they start the American Football League. And that is where football changes. The two things that happen here, the Baltimore Giants game, and Hunt and Adams decide, we've had enough of this, of being ignored. Let us do something. That is me in 1986. That's Pete Rozelle, the commissioner of the National Football League. And he comes in 1960. That's the United States Football League, National Football League antitrust trial. The Southern District, Peter K. Leisure's courtroom back in 1986. The NFL actually lost to the USFL. Donald Trump brought the suit against the NFL antitrust suit, and he won that suit. Rozelle and the Jolt, the swinging 60s. Pro football has entirely changed between 1958 and 1966. Branch Rickey is out of baseball. Branch Rickey is gone from Pittsburgh. He's gone from Brooklyn. And there are a bunch of guys who go with him, and they start, or they have a blueprint for something called the Continental Baseball League, which would become baseball's third major league in 1962, somewhere around there, 61, 62. And Branch Rickey is going around the country trying to get owners interested in the Continental Baseball League. One of the owners that, or one of the potential owners he goes to is Lamar Hunt in Dallas. And Hunt is impressed with Branch Rickey's proposal, but he wants to get this thing, the NFL off, the AFL off the ground. As Lamar told me, he took the concept and borrowed a lot of the concept that Branch Rickey came up with the Continental Baseball League for the American Football League. So the American Football League is formed in 1959, 1960, they're on the field. Emanuel Seller, the Brooklyn congressman in 1961, writes what would become the Sports Broadcast Act of 1961, which yesterday is the anniversary. It was the 59th anniversary of signing it into law. And what it allowed it to do was the NFL could take the 14 teams it had, bunch it together, and sell the package as one to either CBS or NBC. The AFL did that with the American Broadcasting Company. The AFL's negotiator was a guy by the name of Jay Michaels. He negotiated the first ABC AFL deal. You might know his son, Alan Michaels. Alan Michaels is the announcer for Sunday Night Football on NBC. His father did the first big TV deal in football. Prior to the Seller Act, or the Sports Broadcast Act, New York Giants could sell their product to all the TV stations they wanted in the Northeast. The Washington team had the old Confederacy. Green Bay had a slither. Baltimore had a slither. Pittsburgh had a slither. Pete Rozelle had to convince Mara, and now it's Jack Mara because Tim Mara had died, and Wellington Mara, and he had to convince them, and he had to convince Daniel Reeves in Los Angeles and George Halas in Chicago, and George Preston Marshall. You can make more money if we're all as one, as opposed to these individual networks that you have. So television becomes highly important. Congress, I talked about Emmanuel Seller. Kennedy, his impact with his signature, and also the Kennedy administration forced George Preston Marshall to desegregate his Washington team. He wanted to go into a new stadium in Washington in 1962. You know anything about Washington and how Washington operates, the city of Washington, a lot of federal money goes into projects in Washington. It would with this stadium, and Stuart Udell, who was the Secretary of the Interior, told George Preston Marshall, you either hire a Negro player or you're not going into the new stadium. He drafts Ernie Davis. He trades him for Bobby Mitchell. Great thing for Bobby Mitchell's life. He became Mr. Football. Any party in Washington wasn't a party until Bobby Mitchell for 40 years was there. The AFL forms, the NFL forms, and we get that bidding war. Remember that Canton meeting in 1920? We got to stop the bidding war. Well, they have the bidding war for players in 64, 65, particularly after David Sarnoff signed a TV deal with the AFL. There's the 1966 merger and the formation of the New Orleans Saints. Now, the Super Bowl is important. Super Bowl I and II have minimal impact. In fact, the Super Bowl was created by an act of Congress because Russell Long of Louisiana, the senator, fifth most powerful Democratic senator in the Democratic majority in 1966 from Louisiana, and Hale Boggs, Cokie Roberts' father, the congressman from Louisiana, told Pete Rozelle, there's nothing in it for us to merge the AFL and the NFL because New Orleans isn't going to get a team. New Orleans didn't get a team because of Jim Crow in 1965. The American Football League decided to have a game, all-star game, in January of 1965. And they were assured, hey, Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act into law, everything's going to be cool. Well, it wasn't. And the African-American players decided to boycott. The game is moved to Houston. Like I said, no business plan. Oh, yeah, the AFL and the NFL want to merge, but they can't because New Orleans doesn't have a team. Eventually, it's worked out. New Orleans gets a team. Joe Namath makes the Super Bowl important after the first two games have minimal impact. It validates the careers of AFL players, as Ron Mix, who played with the LA and San Diego Chargers, told me many years later. And there's me with the hair on the right, my buddy Bruce Morton on the left, who occasionally comes to these talks, over at ABC Sports, interviewing Joe Namath. And Joe Namath makes the Super Bowl because he guarantees the win, and not only does he guarantee the win, he delivers. The Jets beat Baltimore 16-7, and the Super Bowl becomes an event. A couple of weeks ago, Monday Night Football with Howard Cosell, Keith Jackson, and Don Meredith. Roone Arledge, who is the head of ABC, the NFL wanted, ABC Sports, the NFL, Pete Rozelle, wanted to get some Monday night action in, but neither CBS nor NBC were too interested in Monday Night Football. Now, ABC was a network that was still building itself in the 1960s, and Arledge told Rozelle, we could do this for you. Rozelle also went to Jerry Einhorn, looking to, rather Eddie Einhorn, looking to put together a syndication of TV stations, independent TV stations. Roon said, if we do this, I have to take money from entertainment because it's going to become entertainment. It can't be a regular Sunday afternoon football game. And Rozelle said, well, what do you mean by that? He says, well, it's got to be entertainment. And he said, well, what do you mean by that? Well, we need people like Howard Cosell. And Howard Cosell was on. Don Meredith came through Frank Gifford because Roon called Frank Gifford, said, and Frank was still under contract to CBS, who would be perfect, the perfect foil that you know for Howard. And Giff said, hey, the Gifford said, Don Meredith. And it was because of Frank Gifford that these two guys were put together. And I once talked to Keith Jackson. I said, why were you gone? He said, it saved my life. I couldn't keep up with those two guys. But Meredith and Cosell were literally married by Frank Gifford. 1970s, it becomes a business. Thanks to Lamar Hunt. Jolted the NFL. They went to markets that the NFL wasn't thinking about expanding to. They would eventually expand to Dallas, and that was a reaction to Lamar putting his AFL team in Dallas, and then Minnesota. And they really didn't expand to Minnesota because the guys, Max Winter and his guys in Minnesota who owned the team, opted out of the American Football League. They still had the organization and the money, and they decided to go to the National Football League, which created a lot of problems. They should have left them in the AFL because the AFL plugged that hole with the Oakland Raiders, and that's where Al Davis went. They would have saved themselves a lot of misery had they just said, hey, Max, stay in the AFL. But 2020 is hindsight. In the 1970s, it becomes a business. Television contracts give teams more money. There is a new league starting, the World Football League, and the National Football League decides to cut off the two best areas at that point for expansion, other than New York and Chicago, which really were the two best areas, Nassau and Suffolk County, and also Chicago. The NFL did its survey, but the next two were Seattle and Tampa. Let's take that away from the World Football League. World Football League starts, and it almost immediately folds. It comes back into action in 1975, starts in 74. There's a guy named Chris Hemmeter, who is the head of, remember Sambo's, the chain of Sambo's, and he puts them on some sort of budget. He folds the league. Hemmeter's got his business in Hawaii, and voila, all of a sudden, the NFL Pro Bowl is in Hawaii. Gee, I wonder if that was a payoff to Chris Hemmeter. They said no. I kind of wonder about that. And the Players Association and the NFL owners go to war. There is a strike of a preseason game between the New England Patriots and the New York Jets. The football pains continued in the 1980s. That's me in the middle with Harvey Meyerson and the United States Football League draft. And again, Bruce is in that picture standing next to me. And we're talking, Harvey and I, about what was going on in the courtroom that day. The football pains, the 1982 NFL players strike. The USFL starts also in 1982, their first season, 1983. There is the 1986 USFL NFL antitrust case, which minimized the NFL's antitrust protection at that point. There was the 1987 NFL players strike, which led to replacements, which led to that movie, Replacements, where the Washington team was in that movie. And the game's popularity skyrockets. And a lot of the popularity that skyrocketed was because of a guy by the name of Charles McNeil. He was a University of Chicago professor, and he figured out the point spread. Made it rather easy, or it gave him another prop, actually, when you bet football, and he did that in the mid-1930s, Charles McNeil. TV enriched the owners and the players. Fox Sports comes in the 1990s. Rupert Murdoch is really desperate. He's got the Gary Shandling show. He's got the Tracy Ullman show. He's got The Simpsons. He's got a couple other shows, but nothing is working. And he rolls the dice. Big roll of the dice. I'm going on after the NFL. That's about 1993. And he does. And he pays the NFL an enormous amount of money for National Football Conference games. taking it away from CBS. And also there were some secondary things that happened. Fox and CBS flip-flop stations in places like Detroit. They became a Fox affiliate because they wanted Lions games. Also Milwaukee and some other places. Cleveland was another place. So CBS not only lost the NFL, but they lost VHF stations in some pretty good markets. So the contract becomes official in 1993. The NFL also becomes a political force in Arizona in 1992. The NFL, to help Bill Bidwell, who screwed up the Phoenix market when he moved there in 1987, gives him a Super Bowl for the 92-93 Super Bowl. But Arizona originally passes Martin Luther King Day. There's a new governor that comes in, Evan Meacham, and he's a Republican, and he undoes what the legislature did the year before. No Martin Luther King Day. And John McCain goes along with it, saying that we don't need additional federal holidays. Well, Stevie Wonder decides he is now going to boycott Arizona. Other people decide to boycott Arizona. The NFL is in the dither here. There is a vote in 1990 to overturn what the governor did. Meacham is fixed. The NFL pulls the game. It goes out to San Diego, Pasadena, rather. But the NFL comes back and says in 1992, listen, if you make Martin Luther King a holiday in Arizona, we'll give you the next available Super Bowl, which is in 1996. The force of the NFL, the pressure of the NFL, it's become a big business by this point. The voters respond. They say yes to the holiday. Arizona got its Super Bowl in 1996. It was a franchise movement in the 1990s. Art Modell takes the Browns from Cleveland, moves them to Baltimore, become the Ravens. Bud Adams moves from Houston to Memphis and then to Nashville. So you start to see the moves. There was a move in the 1980s of the Baltimore Colts to Indianapolis and a lateral move in Los Angeles where Carol Rosenblum went down to Anaheim and left the Coliseum. After 1994, both Los Angeles teams leave with the Rams and George Fontanni moving to St. Louis. And Al Davis, who is looking for a new stadium in Los Angeles, he went to a quarry pit in Irwindale, got $10 million put in his pocket. They never built a stadium there. He was going to build one on at the Hollywood Park Racetrack where the Rams now play, roughly that area. And that fell through, and he went back to Oakland. Again, the Raiders being a problem. Franchise movement runs rampant in the 1990s. The big problem today, besides COVID, besides the players' protests, I'll get into that in a minute, that's been swept under the table, brain injuries. And President Obama, Barack Obama in 2014, had a White House summit in 2014 about brain injuries, and that's the last we've heard of the White House involved with brain injuries. Colin Kaepernick took a knee in 2016. Nobody noticed he took a knee the first two times he did it. The sports writer caught it in the third preseason game with San Francisco 49ers and asked Kaepernick about it. And Kaepernick came back and said that he was against police brutality, and this is what he was doing. This was his protest, taking a knee during the national anthem. And all of a sudden, this becomes a political football, whether or not Colin Kaepernick is disrespecting the flag, and all of this is wrong, and how come the NFL players are in it. As Al Davis once told me, the NFL markets itself as a paramilitary entity, and they depend on fans buying into it. That's what he told me. And he said, your world and my world do not collide. And now I said to AD, I said, you're absolutely correct. I can't conceive of your world, and I know you can't conceive of my world. And nor could he conceive of the world of modern players, although he took care of a lot of the Raider players, and nobody ever talked about it. It's a well-oiled machine. Concussions are a problem. The NFL and Kaepernick have been a problem over the last 4 years. After the when George Floyd was killed by a Minneapolis policeman, the NFL had to take an inner look. not because they necessarily wanted to take an inner look. They were getting hammered by the President of the United States over the national anthem and players disrespecting the flag and all that other stuff. And they were getting hammered by it. But after they saw what was going on in the streets all summer, Roger Goodell and the NFL has got one of the greatest public relations arms in the world. Absolutely one of the greatest. The NFL took a look and they saw which way the wind is blowing. And they saw who was protesting in the streets. And they saw that it was a lot of young people. And they saw it was people of color. And those are their fans. And they're going to have to make a decision here. Do we support Black Lives Matter or don't we support Black Lives Matter? We also have a problem. Most of our players are African American. What are we going to do? Not too far from me, up the street, literally in Bronxville, is Roger Goodell's house. And Roger was the commissioner of the National Football League. And he put out a statement that Black Lives Matter. And they were going to allow players to protest and speak their minds because athletes should be seen and not heard. At least that's the Olympic credo. That's what Laura Ingraham said on Fox News, shut up and dribble. And that's what a lot of people say. We don't care about what your political views are. Entertain us. That's what we want. And it's hard to tell from TV ratings whether or not there's a backlash. Raiders game last week did real well. Other games didn't do well. NFL has a problem in Los Angeles and New York with TV ratings perennially. They're not very good. People don't sit around in New York to watch the Jets and Giants. Even in the Jets, or rather the Giants, big days, great days with George Young running the ship, and they never drew well on TV. They are just not big TV markets for the NFL. It's not Buffalo. It's not Pittsburgh. It's not Kansas City. It's not Green Bay. Green Bay has a huge following. Pittsburgh probably has the biggest following in the NFL. They may be America's team, the real America's team, not the Dallas Cowboys. So the NFL is looking ahead, and looking ahead, the business of the NFL is going to be quite good. Major League Baseball just picked up a huge contract from AT&T Turner Sports. The NFL, Fox is about ready to give them a whole bunch of money to keep the NFC games. Fox wants to continue its relationship with the NFL, and there are reasons why they will overpay for the NFL. They also get the Super Bowl during the TV contracts, and the Super Bowl sets the advertising rates for the month afterwards in April and May after the Super Bowl. And for the network affiliates, it's big bucks. They win the February sweeps. The sweeps, February and May and November. That's where you set your advertising rates. You got the #1 TV show in February, the Super Bowl. You make a lot of money, no matter what you pay for it. So that's the NFL. They start, no business plan. They end, and they have a business plan. Oh yeah, Oakland Raiders. I survived a party with them in 1995. Big Ben Davidson, who broke Joe Namath's jaw. This Super Bowl, Sandra was featured on every Giants game in the 1980s and 90s, wearing her tiara, wearing her sash, and wearing next to nothing. And Phil Vilipiano, who was with the Oakland Raiders, and this is a party that I was at in Toms River, New Jersey, back in 1995. Thank you so much. I am going to open it up for questions and comments. Let's go at it. Anybody have anything to say before we wrap it up, and you can watch the Jets-Denver Broncos game? We could, you can unmute yourselves if you have anything, or you can put it in the box. It's up to you if you have anything to say. And if you don't have anything to say, I want to thank you. Thank you, Kent, Eric, Carl, Brenda.
Hey, Evan, I got a few comments for you.
Keep them to a short few because there may be other people who want to talk.
Okay. We're going to have to get you a colored cab.
That's part of the AFL thing, and that's part of my Super Bowl talk about the African American boycott of the New Orleans game.
Yeah.
So that's part of another talk.
And G.A. Richards only owned the Lions for 5 years. 5 years from 1934 to 1939. That was it.
Yeah, but he got them into NBC radio.
Right.
Thank you. Let me just say thank you, Betsy. I appreciate your kind words. But he got them into radio because the NFL didn't even want their games on radio. Nor
Right.
Major League Baseball owners, because they felt people would stay away. It was radio. By 1940, they were able to, by 1940, get that Chicago Bears-Washington game on national radio, that game that was the rout.
73 to nothing.
73 to nothing, and but it was on radio. And that begins the NFL on national, well, actually the Thanksgiving game began the NFL on radio in 1934. But G.A. Richards does have a place in NFL history, even though
Right.
he wasn't there that long. Anybody else? Well, thank you, Betsy, and thank you, everybody else, for coming tonight. And if you're watching the football game, thank you, Eric. I appreciate it and new information. There you go. Thank you. And I don't know how many of you are going to watch the Jets play the Denver Broncos, but you might laugh at that. And here's another reason people pay for a lot of TV. People are complaining about the NFL ratings. The NFL ratings, if you look at the TV shows that are on, the NFL will come back with 17 of the top 20 rated shows of the year in the United States. Outside the United States, they get some viewers in Canada and Mexico, but you know, it's not like table tennis in China where you might get 750 million people watching, or India, Pakistan cricket where you might get 600,000 people watching. The NFL is very provincial, but in American TV, people may complain about the ratings all the time. The number one show every year is the Super Bowl. The number one show every Thursday night is the Thursday night football game. The number one show on Sunday nights is the Sunday night football game. The number one show on Monday nights, Monday night football. It's just, that's why they put money in, because most shows now on TV, if you get 2 million people watching, it's a great audience because TV is so fragmented these days. TV is still important, and TV remains important because the NFL is going to be a TV sport for the most part the rest of the year. And the NFL has got to hope, has to hope, no team in the playoffs has a COVID-19 outbreak, because that may totally screw up the TV schedule in January and February. If you got a team or two teams that can't play, they're in the playoffs, but COVID-19 has an outbreak, that could be a big problem for the NFL. But that's in January, and I doubt there'll be a vaccine by that point. Might be some treatments by that point, but now that Moderna has said they're not going to have anything until spring, the NFL is one step away from crisis mode right now because of that. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I want to thank Jessica for inviting me. And Tabby, thank you so much for hosting and helping me out here.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we